Welcome back, Terms of Service listeners. I am here today with CNN aviation and transportation correspondent Pete Muntean. He is here to help us answer a question that I know is on many of our minds after some of the frightening news headlines in recent months about plane crashes and communication issues, and especially as we gear up for Memorial Day holiday travels. And that is it safe to fly right now? Pete, thank you for being here.
Anytime. Happy to be here.
So before we really get into it, you are not just a reporter when it comes to aviation and transportation. You are also actually a pilot. Tell me about how you got into flying.
I'm really lucky. I grew up around aviation, and I have remarkable privilege in that way. Both of my parents were pilots, so I was in small airplanes when I was like 2 weeks old, which was very cool. And my mom was an air show pilot and an aerobatic pilot. She had a flight school. Also, growing up, I announced for her at air shows. We were the only mother-son team, which was very fun.
I love it.
My dad had a few aviation businesses, one that modified airplanes. I was very much an only child, and so I got to go with them pretty much everywhere to trade shows and stuff. And so kind of grew up in the back of the family airplane. It's called a Piper Lance, which is like a big station wagon, single-engine airplane, and have a ton of fond memories doing that. I also carry my late mother's love of aerobatics with me all the time. I fly aerobatics now. I fly in competition aerobatics, which is a lot of fun. So the more I report on aviation, the more I learn about it. It's a fun and humbling journey. I'll never know it all.
So I was going to ask, you're still flying, and I wanted to know like what kind of plane you fly.
Yeah,
or planes.
So I fly two different airplanes. So I have an airplane called a Super Decathlon, which is a two-seat airplane. You sit one in front of the other. You strap yourself in with these big harnesses. Think sort of like what you see race car drivers putting on. The seatbelts, this is always kind of disconcerting to passengers. They have ratchets on them to ratchet yourself in nice and tight for aerobatic flying. It's sort of just a fun flying airplane. It doesn't go very far. It doesn't go super fast. It's good at aerobatics. And then I also fly a Beech Bonanza, which is a six-seater single-engine airplane, sort of more synonymous with small airplane flying. You can go a little faster. You can go a little higher. It's not really a replacement for the airlines, but it offers a lot of utility and flexibility. It's pretty awesome.
Okay, so I imagine that the answer to this is like a lot of things, but will you give us an overview of what kinds of technologies are involved in keeping planes in the air and having them navigate safely?
So let's sort of limit it to commercial flying. Air traffic control really sort of keeps airplanes separated, spaced out properly. The spacing can change based on the weather conditions and how much volume, they call it, an airport can handle at any one given time. So air traffic control is really critical to airline flying. It's a huge layer of safety. And when there's a hole in that layer of safety, it's called the Swiss cheese model. And so usually if something bad goes wrong, something is able to sort of go through one hole in the Swiss cheese and then maybe not hit another hole at the next layer to keep things safe. So there's sort of the infrastructure system at air traffic control, and then there's the people layer of the system in air traffic control. And then in airplanes, there are technologies to avoid collisions. That's called TCAS. That's Traffic Collision Avoidance System, pretty literal. And it'll tell pilots of a commercial airliner climb or descend or turn if there is a collision sort of brewing in front of them. Those are the big two technologies when it comes to keeping planes from hitting one another. And there are some other sort of emerging technologies too, but those are all of those systems are really born out of previous incidents. So TCAS came as a result of a collision between a small airplane and a commercial flight in San Diego in the late 70s. There have been advancements on advancements in aviation. The sad reality is a lot of those are born out of fatal accidents. We say in aviation, the rules are written in blood.
Can you describe what happens in an air traffic control center and how air traffic controllers are actually communicating with pilots?
Yeah, so I think people have this image of air traffic controllers always being in a control tower where they're looking out the window, they have binoculars, they're talking on the radio, and they're able to physically see what's going on. That is one version. That's one version of the facilities that make up the air traffic control system. But then there are other facilities where controllers don't see anything but what's on their radar scope. So there are things called TRACONs, which are called Terminal Radar Approach Control Facilities, and centers. Centers control airplanes primarily up high. TRACONs control airplanes primarily down low, approaching the airspace that would be controlled by a tower and airplanes that have just left that space. So it's usually a dark room. You're usually only able to see what's on the radar scope in front of you. You're responsible for a little sliver of airspace they call a sector. There are not only switch panels to be able to talk on different radio frequencies, but then there's usually a phone that they call the landline to coordinate between other sectors. And then every controller has in front of them something called strips. And that is actually what signifies a physical airplane. And it says the airplane type, where it's going, where it came from, what it's doing. The other big player here is the weather. And so when bad weather strikes, that can really throw existing flight routes and all best laid plans for a loop.
You touched on this, but how have we seen aviation technology evolve in the last few decades?
I'll tell you just from my experience, and then I'll sort of tell you from my reporting. When I was a kid flying around with my parents, now I kind of know sometimes their judgment wasn't so great. They had in this little airplane that we flew around in, this little six-seater we flew around in, something called a storm scope. And it was just a little, like, probably the size of, like, the circumference of a coffee cup. It was on the instrument panel. And the only piece of information you could get out of that was where lightning strikes were. And that's it. Like, it couldn't tell you where it was raining. It could just tell you there was a lightning strike here and a lightning strike there. So that is like ancient technology now. And, you know, my parents would fly using ground-based radio beacons. That is also essentially ancient technology now. GPS has come into the fold. I can get weather and actually see where other airplanes are on my phone using a data link. So there have been leaps and bounds technologically in aviation. Commercial airplanes have had that TCAS system for decades. Now we have similar kind of systems in small airplanes, which are it's pretty amazing, the technological advance. So ADS-B is the biggest technological advance we've seen in aviation. That stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. It's kind of a mouthful. It is technology trotted out by the FAA, mandated in 2020 for all airplanes operating in what they call the National Airspace System to have this technology. And it shows with more clarity where you are than what a radar would provide. So you've probably seen at least shots of a radar, like in Top Gun, or like the
that,
big
like,
red
circular
sweeping
sort
thing.
of screen.
Yes,
on the...
yeah, and it displays on a screen, and usually it's on a tower, and there's a big red sort of dish that rotates around outside, and that provides controllers in a tower or a radar facility where airplanes are. That is incumbent upon the how quickly the radar sweeps around. So there's a lag in what controllers can see on their scopes. Usually it takes, for an airplane, is like 6 to 12 seconds with radar. With ADS-B, this new technology, it's about every second. So it provides controllers a lot more information, granular information, like real time up to the minute, up to the second, really. And the other flip side of that is that if you have the proper equipment in your airplane or helicopter, it can show you that information that controllers are seeing also. So it provides not only air traffic control better information, but pilots better information.
Right, so they can communicate better because they know what each of them are looking at.
Yeah, you're kind of seeing the same picture. So you're not having to interpolate in your mind's eye and figure out what this controller is talking about. And so it's very, very critical in avoiding collisions. It doesn't really replace what you can see with your eyeball, but it really provides a much better fidelity, much more clearer picture than you would, say, 20 or 30 years ago. You know, in aviation, we talk a lot about spatial awareness or situational awareness, which means just sort of being aware of the situation that you're in. And accidents happen when you sort of lose that ability to figure out where things are, where airplanes are, where the weather is. It helps you make better decisions. Aviation is primarily a judgment game. And so you need to have information in order to make good decisions and judgment.
So why is it that in the past few months we have seen so much bad news in the aviation the crashes that we've seen, the communication issues at Newark International Airport? Is this year worse than past years? Like, what's happening?
Well, the Potomac crash would have been news regardless because that was the first major air disaster since the Colgan Air crash of 2009. That was the last time there were major fatalities in a U.S. commercial airline flight. So that was really significant. I think we have been paying a lot of attention to the warning signs. And so in 2023, there was a huge uptick in near collisions involving commercial flights at major airports, JFK, Austin, Boston, Burbank, huge airports that didn't typically have this problem. Then they rose to the level of news. It was sort of good because we were covering, in a way, incidents that could happen. And they were incidents, but they didn't turn into accidents. They didn't turn into injuries or fatalities. So there's a bit of a silver lining there. This year has been pretty remarkable when it comes to aviation because of the Potomac mid-air collision, because of the reforms that will come out of that, because of the attention paid to that. The news cycle is so short, but I think people really sat up and thought about, well, gee, there were all these warning signs, a shortage of air traffic controllers. There was a brain drain during the pandemic where a lot of old hand pilots ready to retire retired a bit early. A lot of new people coming into aviation. There's a pilot shortage at the commercial airlines. So a lot of things are changing. And the Newark issues are sort of a microcosm of all of that too, but on the other end. So that's all about infrastructure, the back-end technology at air traffic control facilities, which is getting very old now, and the shortage of people, the other end of the system. So that is a real microcosm. It's symptomatic of all of these things that have been going on in the air traffic control world that can really degrade safety. Mm-hmm. And so people ask, like, are we just covering this stuff more? I think people do care more, which in a way drives the coverage. But these are all significant enough that we probably would have been covering it anyway.
Right. And what about, we saw the airplane that flipped upside down in Toronto. I think that was this year. This year feels like it's been a million months. We saw the plane that crashed in Philadelphia, or in Pennsylvania. Anyways,
you're right.
Are those things connected too? Or these are just like bad things that are all happen to be happening at the same time?
It's a little hard to say because a lot of those incidents, we have such a small snapshot into what actually went down. And so, you kind of have to wait to see how the investigation pans out in order to sort of, if there's any chance at sort of building a thread between one and the other. I would say that the Philadelphia crash, which was a private jet on a medevac flight, was probably a bit of a one-off. The Toronto crash, there were some environmental conditions there. There was blowing snow across the runway. That makes things pretty challenging. The wind is pretty high. So that's a little different than a commercial flight and a helicopter hitting each other at night in clear weather. Everyone says that was very, very avoidable. And the more we learn about it, and the position of the helicopter route there in reference to the approach path that commercial flight American 5342 was taking, that was essentially, everyone says, an accident waiting to happen. An untenable risk to safety is what NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy called it. So, sure, there's a little connective tissue, but not the biggest. And I think the Philadelphia crash we covered more because people were paying attention more just because it was like barely a week after the mid-air collision over the Potomac.
Right.
So, aviation is risky and bad things happen. And aviation's always very committed to safety and to try and figure out what went wrong. And in all of those cases, especially the Potomac crash, it's a very granular investigation to really sort of get to the bottom of it. We know what happened. We know airplane and helicopter hit one another. How it happened will be really interesting. And there will be volumes of contributing factors, they call them, that will sort of help build the big picture of and the story of how that tragedy occurred.
So on Newark, what is actually happening at the airport that is causing these delays? We're seeing flight restrictions, but in particular, we've seen a number of these incidents where it appears that the air traffic controllers have lost communication with planes that are in the air.
That's the big thing here. And so we know that the incident where controllers in the approach control facility, which is the dark room facility that I described earlier, where they're just looking at the radar scope, and so they can only see airplanes via the scope and communicate with them via radio, they lost radar and radio for 90 seconds back on April 28th, which a controller will tell you that's an eternity. Because things are happening so fast. These airplanes are moving at hundreds of miles an hour, covering a lot of ground every second. And so for controllers to not be able to see where airplanes were or communicate with them via voice is really problematic. And I talked to one controller in the TRACON there who said he was there at the time of the incident. He says it's possibly the worst thing that can happen to you as a controller. The issue is now we're finding out that this happened a few times before that incident that really sort of brought this to light. And this also has happened a couple times after that incident. So there's 4 or 5 cases where controllers at the Newark approach control facility lost radar and radio for 30 to 90 seconds in the last year. There was one in October, one in November, this one in April, and then essentially a couple rapid fire, one last Friday, and then one the Sunday after. The FAA says it's installed this backup line, and what is at the center of this issue is the infrastructure. An old copper wire, they say, that essentially runs this facility, which moved to Philadelphia, even though it's responsible for the Newark airspace last July, moved to Philadelphia from Long Island. And so they're essentially running this new facility off of the old facility. Someone described it to our Renee Marsh as like running it like off an extension cord. So this old copper
That sounds
wire.
horrible.
I know. This old copper wire essentially carries the radar data and the voice communications. And so when that goes down and the backup doesn't kick in, it's essentially a blackout, meaning there's no controllers. Controllers cannot communicate and cannot see you. So that's a huge problem. So it really all goes back to this move that the FAA did and the shortage of controllers. The FAA wanted to entice more controllers to work in this Newark sector of airspace. And so instead of having them move to Long Island, they thought, well, maybe we'll do it out of Philadelphia. And so they instituted this move last July to try and sort of bolster their numbers. But by moving this facility, it introduced new problems. This is always the rub in aviation. Like, you don't want to mess with success and do things too fast because it can introduce new problems and failures.
And is there not a world where they just say, now we've lost this connection, you think you said 5 times? Like, do we just move back so we're not in this extension cord system?
I don't think they'll move back. I feel like that would be almost admitting defeat. The FAA insists that they have controllers in the pipeline. They've got trainees working there doing on-the-job training right now. And that they have fixed the system. They have done an upgrade patch on the radars, and they've replaced the line, or they're replacing the line with a backup also. So they feel like they've built in some redundancy, which is so key in aviation. So I don't think they'll move back, but a lot of people are watching, including me. I mean, I know the moment when there's a failure there, because in November, there was a failure on November 6th. It was at overnight, and the controllers were trying to turn. They were talking to a FedEx flight, giving them vectors, turning them onto the final approach path into Newark when they had one of these blackouts. And so instead of this FedEx flight that they were communicating with making this critical turn, the FedEx flight just kept zooming east and into the busy airspace over LaGuardia. And this one controller who I spoke with told me it's a by the grace of God. He said it was a miracle that there was not a mid-air collision because that was really dangerous. Now, there are systems in place. There are procedures in place that pilots and controllers follow when they lose communication. And we're going to get a bit more of a glimpse into that. You know, the Department of Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby, they've both told me there's no major safety risk here, but lay that against what the controllers are saying, that this could have been really bad.
Well, yeah, and you've reported that 5 air traffic controllers at Newark took a 45-day trauma leave after that April 28th communication incident. And I can understand why that would be so stressful if you think there's a possibility that a collision could have occurred on your watch because of that. I
mean, they say it's the worst possible thing that can happen to them. I can't imagine what that would be like. I've never been an air traffic controller, although I've worked in the simulators for stories, and it was hard. It was really difficult, and you really have to have in your mind's eye a knowledge of where things are and where airplanes are going. Things change really quickly, and it's not easy.
Is this something that might be happening at other airports and we just don't know about it yet? Or is this something that is, sort of like this unique confluence of issues that Newark is dealing with right now?
Newark is a unique situation. The staffing, trauma leave, and the infrastructure issues leading to these failures, that is a real perfect storm. But we know that those issues separately occur at different places all the time. There's a shortage of controllers nationwide. We know that. We know that air traffic control infrastructure is old. And there will be times when frequencies go down, so controllers can't communicate with pilots, and there will be times when radar scopes go down. And we're learning of another incident in Denver earlier this week. And so Newark is special, but in a way not special. It's just kind of the intersection of all these bad things at once.
So I hate to tell you that none of this is making me feel very good.
Sorry. I hate to be that guy. I love and derive a lot of joy out of aviation. I don't want to make people afraid. And the good news here is that aviation has so many layers of safety. There are so many safety nets built in that when one goes down, usually the other can pick up some slack. But it's not a good thing that these things keep happening. It's why we cover them, and it's why we hold the powerful to account and question what the heck is going on here.
So is it safe to be flying right now?
I'd say generally it's very safe. And I think that incidents make pilots and controllers and flight attendants and the professionals in aviation, essentially the first responders in aviation, more vigilant. And I think everyone has their guard up in a big way, especially after the midair collision. And also on the controller side, too. I think people now, recent incidents sort of make it top of mind so that aviation in general is sort of training for the next thing. In a way, you have to be a little reactionary and know what could go wrong and know that the most recent thing probably won't happen again because it just happened. But you have to, keep it always in the back of your mind. What happens if you lose communication with air traffic control? What happens if there's a mid-air collision unfolding in front of you? How will you react? So I think aviation in general really takes great care to make it so that when these bad things happen, they don't turn into the worst thing that could happen.
And they don't repeat, it sounds like you're saying. Like, we learn from each thing that's happened.
Yeah, generally. Incidents are a great teacher. And failure is a great teacher, sadly.
Do the incidents that we've seen this year and you're talking about the shortage of FAA controllers, for example, does any of this have to do with some of the government spending cuts that we've seen the Trump administration make since he took office in January?
Not really. Controllers were pretty insulated from that. The FAA has been also relatively insulated at large. There were some folks who work on the back end infrastructure or support those who work on the back end infrastructure, I should say, at the the FAA who were cut by DOGE, probationary employees. At one point, it was about 400. About 150 came back. The Trump administration would say it's not having a big impact, and controllers are heavily unionized, and making cuts to that workforce is sort of like the electrified third rail, and usually that does not happen easily. The Reagan administration fired all the controllers in the union back in the early 80s, which in a way contributed to the shortage of controllers we're in now, but it sort of stems back even decades before that. I won't bore you with all the details, but this
has been coming. This has been a long time coming. It's not
Yes.
just a thing that's happening this year.
Yes.
What does the government plan to do to address these issues?
The big thing right now is that they're looking at trying to incentivize people to come into the controller workforce, giving them different, essentially financial incentives when they reach certain benchmarks, to incentivize people from retiring. So a lot of controllers are eligible to retire around 50, even though the mandatory retirement age is 56. So keeping them on, giving them a bonus for every year that they stay on, and scrambling to hire more people. And so the FAA, under this administration and previous administrations, have been trying to figure that out. It's not easy. And they're trying to hunt for ducks now where there are ducks. So sometimes they look to people like gamers who are really good
That makes
at
sense.
sort of like working a map and situations and moving things around. And so that is a talent pool that may be undertapped, and trying to make it so that people can earn a good living wage and live in a good place. One of the issues is that the FAA Training Academy is in Oklahoma City, and the FAA knows that a lot of people don't want to go live in Oklahoma City for a while they train, and while there's no guarantee that they pass the training. So there are a lot of factors at play here. People is the big one.
Do we have a sense of how long it is going to take for us to be in a better place? And in the meantime, do we just kind of have to accept that the risk might be slightly higher?
The Trump administration says, and they have trotted out this plan to redo the infrastructure at the FAA and at air traffic control facilities across the country. They say that will take 2 or 3 years. I've been publicly kind of skeptical about that because to do a big build, one of the things they call for is building 6 new air traffic control centers, super centers they call them, which I think 2 to 3 years you may be lucky to break ground. So it seems like, they could dig their way out of the people shortage in a few years, but the stats aren't very rosy, because if they're netting only a few dozen people a year and you're 3,000 short, then you're talking about decades to fill the void.
Well, and if you're talking about building new facilities, like how many hundreds of billions of dollars is that going to cost?
The price tag has been a little murky, and there's a bill right now that says maybe 12 or 15 billion. That number has fluctuated some. We've also heard 30 billion. So it's going to be a big lift.
What about the airlines themselves? Is there anything that they can do to help improve safety, or is it really incumbent on the government to address this issue?
The airlines are actually calling on the government to address it, and United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby has been particularly hard on the FAA for years, saying that they need to fix the shortage of controllers, they need to fix the infrastructure, and he's been very hard on them about Newark because that's a huge hub for United Airlines for transcontinental and transatlantic flights and beyond. So he says that the way to fix the system is for the FAA to limit the number of flights into Newark, something they call slot rules, and making it so that if United scales down its flights when there's a huge meltdown like this at Newark, that other airlines don't swoop in and fill the void and then make it too crowded, overcrowded. And so right now, the airlines and the FAA are meeting to essentially sort of put a new cap on that. And so there are things that airlines can do, essentially not overschedule flights, keep things reasonable, make it so that they know in a way what they're getting into, and to build the proper time into things. So the big thing is for airlines to sort of be realistic. There's a huge boom in travel. They want to fill every seat. There's a big corporate need for shareholder value and to make it so that they're making money and there's a lot of revenue, but they have to be realistic.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. I have an upcoming flight out of Newark. We'll see how we feel about keeping that. But
Goodness.
I did get that email from United CEO Scott Kirby that basically said, this is perfectly safe, not to worry. And I think it's so interesting that at the same time, he is calling on the FAA to make it safer. I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. But I'm curious, for everyday travelers, are there certain airports or airlines that are going to be better or safer? Like, is there anything as individuals that we can do to try to keep ourselves safer?
I will give you the tips that I give everybody. This is not necessarily a safety thing, but more a convenience thing, which is book the first flight out of the day. You have a much higher chance statistically of getting there on time. Try to book flights that are nonstop. Connecting sort of builds in more unknowns into a trip. Sometimes that's hard, and sometimes that's way more expensive. And really just have a lot of patience for it, because it wasn't all that long ago that the Wright brothers invented this. We're talking like 122 years ago. So it's pretty miraculous that the airlines do this with such reliability, and to kind of zoom out and be like, we could be doing this in a covered wagon. Like, it's pretty, it's pretty amazing that aviation happens with such reliability and such quickness. It's a really tough system, and for it to work so well and to work so well safely is a really incredible thing.
Yeah, I do. I feel now even more grateful than ever every time I get off the plane, to the pilots, to the flight attendants. I'm like, thank you so much for keeping us safe here.
I'd say wear your seatbelt. That's the big safety thing. Some people get really lax about that. And we see people, top cause of injuries on commercial flights is turbulence. And I'm always on with my seatbelt, and it's tight.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Anytime.